All right, Leviticus 11, let's call this one clean. Why? Because chapter 11 through roughly 18 is a section of Leviticus that deals with the distinction between clean and unclean things. Chapter 11 focusing on clean and unclean animals, which reminded me of the popularity now of food shows, because in a lot of ways, food can give you insight into a culture. And I've noticed, like I think many of you might have, that food shows are really popular, not just here in the States, but food shows that give us an insight into what folks are eating overseas. And comparing that to what I saw here in Leviticus 11 helped me in a lot of ways realize that Israel had a unique food culture. And in the places I've been, the travel shows I've seen, I don't think I've seen any other culture that really overlaps with the things that God is communicating here about his priorities regarding clean and unclean foods. Why? Because here in the States, we might consider something like a mouse something that we just would not want to eat. But there are parts of the world where they would say, oh, there's no way I would eat any parts of a pig. When here in the States, we, in a lot of ways, have spent time building shrines to bacon. And so there are many people here who couldn't dream of life without consuming some part of a pig. But that kind of sums it up. Grasshoppers are something we wouldn't eat here, but the Bible has no problem with things like grasshoppers and crickets being some of the few insects that it's going to say here are okay. But fast forward to the New Covenant, and in chapter 11, Peter is going to have an encounter with God that's going to completely shake his idea of what is clean or unclean anymore, even as a Torah observant Jew. And so ultimately, God is shaking all of our assumptions, cultural or otherwise, about what is clean or unclean, because ultimately he is restoring things to a place of perfect peace. Going all the way back to our discussion of Genesis 1, we noticed that the animals weren't even given over for food until violence had proliferated on the earth, until God hit reset and started things over through Noah. And then in chapter 9, verse 3, it's going to say, now every moving thing that lives shall be food for you. But now that he's starting his nation, he's scaling that back, and he's saying there's some things that are unclean. And externally, we talked about things like mice and pigs that in certain cultures have external habits that make us want to say, that's not something I necessarily want to eat. But also notice that there are some things that seem to tie into spiritual things that God considers unclean, and they have to do with death. And so fish aside, of the birds and the land animals that are considered unclean, those that hunt or kill to feed themselves are considered unclean for Israel to eat. Understand that's not completely unlike what we're going to see later in the life of David, who, even though he's a man after God's own heart, is not allowed to build a temple because he is also a man of blood. But understand, once again, as we talked about earlier, probably more or less in Genesis 1 and then Genesis 9, that Isaiah, the prophet in chapter 11, verse 9, is saying that they shall not hurt or destroy in all my holy mountain. He's restoring that level of peace. And the Revelation is going to say something similar, a verse we use here often. He's going to wipe away every tear. There'll be no more death, nor pain, nor mourning. All the former things will have passed away. And so when we look at it like that, I don't think it's any shock that as much as he loved David, David being a man of blood, a man of suffering in some ways, wasn't fit for certain roles. And likewise, animals that made a living by death were not fit for consumption. And ultimately, understand likewise, just as there's no one culture that can completely understand what God is doing in restoring a perfect peace to his creation. One of those travel shows I saw recently made a stop in Japan, and it talked about some of the formal, what we would consider formalities of Japanese culture, points to the fact that they are respecting the fact that an animal had to suffer for them to eat, and they're not the only ones. And so I love that kind of insight because it helps me understand how certain cultures still preserve today the kind of spirit that it seems God is trying to help us to appreciate in chapters like Leviticus 11, where he's helping us to understand that we are simply at a midpoint on the road to a creation where he's once again perfecting peace. God's best to you as you go forward in him, though.